Welcome aboard. I'm National Weather Service meteorologist Peter Chan with your Alaska Marine Weather Outlook on this Thursday, January 16th, 2025. And we're going to start out, as usual, with the sea ice. And the ice extent has certainly spread through the North Bering Sea as the result of some colder temperatures. But we're having a push of milder air now come up from the south, and a frontal system that will be pushing across the Kuskokwim, Bristol Bay areas up through the lower Yukon is going to force temperatures back up above freezing as we get into late Friday and certainly by Saturday. Initially, though, ahead of this front, we're going to see east to southeast winds, so the ice could drift a bit westward, especially north and west there of Macquarie Island to west of St. Lawrence. And the other thing is for Bristol Bay and Kuskokwim Bays, there is the potential for some minor coastal flooding as a couple different waves of low pressure bring in some brisker winds, and I'll show that when we get to that portion of the state. So Friday's marine weather forecast shows the inner channels of the Panhandle, northwest winds 15-20 knots, but there could be some gusts to 35 knots there around Petersburg and within Stevens Passage. Waves generally running 4 feet, maybe upwards of 6 feet there outside of Ketchikan and Metlakatla and Dixon Entrance. And then Sitka south through Craig, offshore there, northwest to north winds 10 to 15 knots. Those winds, though, are easterly out of the icy strait up through Yakutat and Cape Suckling at 15 to 20 knots with waves of 6 to 8 feet. And then on Saturday, for the inner channels, winds will be southerly 20 knots there in Lynn Canal with 4-foot waves, southeast winds to 20 knots with 4-foot waves in Stevens Passage. And then further south, northwest winds 20 knots around Ketchikan and Metlakatla with 4-foot waves. Generally, easterly offshore winds will prevail on Saturday for the nearshore waters of the Gulf Coast. Sitka down through Craig, look for northeast to east winds 15 to 20 knots, but those winds will pick up 25 to 30 knots outside of Yakutat Bay and upwards of 35 knots there at Cape Suckling, where waves could be as high as 15, 16 feet. For the northwestern Gulf and Cook Inlet, we're looking at strongest winds near the entrance and lower Cook Inlet, southeast to east winds 35 knots with waves up to 12 feet possible, especially there toward Kamishak Bay. And then northeast winds 20 to 25 knots, middle and upper Cook Inlet with waves of 5 to 8 feet. Prince William Sound will see easterly winds of 15 knots, 3-foot waves, and outside of Hinchinbrook entrance, winds could be southeasterly up to 25 knots with waves of 7 to 9 feet. On Saturday, that frontal boundary is going to be pushing northward and approaching the region. So easterly winds ahead of that front, strongest winds, 2 areas. First, outside of Hinchinbrook entrance, we could be looking at 45 to 50 knot low-end storm force winds with 12 to 13-foot waves. And then down there at the entrance of Cook Inlet into lower Cook Inlet, Kamishak Bay, easterly gales of 40 knots with waves of 11 to 14 feet. Prince William Sound will see winds of 30 knots out of the east with waves up to 7 feet. And then across the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island for Friday, southeast winds 30 to 35 knots across Kodiak Island. And then on the North Pacific side, Chiknik down through False Pass, southeasterly gales to 35 knots. On the Bering side, southeasterly gales of 35 to 40 knots, especially there within and outside of Bristol Bay, waves 4 to 6 feet. On Saturday, winds will be east-southeast to 30 knots across Kodiak Island, 8-foot waves within Shelikof Strait. And then as we get down there between Chiknik and Akiak, 35 knot southeasterly gales that continue across up into Bristol Bay. And then as we trail out along the peninsula for southeast to south winds, right around 20 knots, waves 13 to 14 feet on the North Pacific side and 3 to 4 feet on the Bering side. So a broad area of low pressure will be lifting northward across the Aleutians. Ahead of it, southeast winds up to 30 knots there for the far eastern Aleutians, including on Alaska and Dutch Harbor. Winds variable, only around 10 knots near that center of low pressure as it passes up through Adak and Atka. Off to the west, winds turn back northerly, strongest to 30 knots there, Kiska to Shimia on Friday. And then for Saturday, in the wake of that low, we have a southwest to west flow of 20 knots there over the eastern Aleutians, going back northwest to north, and then northeasterly, generally right around 20 to 25 knots from the middle Aleutians way out to Kiska and Shemya. Along the southwest coast Friday, we're expecting southeasterly winds to 30 knots within Bristol Bay and Kuskokwim Bay as this frontal system gradually lifts northeastward. Winds will generally be southeast 20 to 25 knots, the Pribilofs on up through St. Matthew. And then as we go farther north, we're looking for southeast winds 25 knots through Etolan Strait and along the lower Yukon coast, but ice is in place there. That's why there could be a bit of a westward drift to the ice edge once you get out well southwest of St. Lawrence and Nunavik Islands. 35 knot easterly gales out of Norton Sound. That's on Friday. And then for Saturday, we look down toward Bristol Bay and Kuskokwim Bay. We could see another round of 35 knot to southeasterly gales. Again, that's going to enhance the potential for some minor coastal flooding, especially along that northward stretch of the delta of the Kuskokwim Bay there around Kwagilningak. And then also Togiak could also, areas there westward could experience some higher than normal water levels at high tide. And then as we look along the lower Yukon coast up through Norton Sound, southeasterly winds of 30 knots. And for the Bering Strait, west side of the Seward Peninsula and the north side of St. Lawrence Island, at least as of now, there are blizzard warnings that will continue into Friday for St. Lawrence Island. Strong gusty winds, sustained 30-knot northeast winds. Coming up through the lower Chukchi Sea out of Kotzebue Sound and Point Hope, easterly gales to 35 knots. There will be some blowing snow as well, because as that moisture lifts northward into the colder air, it'll fall as snow. Along the upper Chukchi Sea coast there from Cape Lisburne up to Utqiagvik, east winds to 25 knots, and those east winds trail back off 20 to 15 knots from Prudhoe Bay to Kaktovik. And then finally Saturday, across the Beaufort Sea coast, winds will be generally offshore, southeast to south, 10 to 15 knots, Kaktovik through Prudhoe Bay, southerly 20 knots around Utqiagvik. And then as we drop down along the Chukchi Sea coastline, especially as we get toward Cape Lisburne, Point Hope, all the way through the Bering Strait to the north side of St. Lawrence Island, as well as the west side of the Seward Peninsula and Norton Sound, we're looking at southeasterly winds 30 knots. So there will be areas of blowing snow there across the Chukchi Sea, and especially along the west and north side of the Seward Peninsula. So as usual, stay tuned to the later forecast, especially if you have any adverse weather impacting your area. Have a safe one and enjoy the weekend.